Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Sumeracki, and this is an office hours video from the Learning Scientists. And so for this video, I thought it would be kind of fun to take a look at one of the posters that my students and I presented at a recent conference. So earlier in March 2019, I took my students, specifically two of my McNair Scholar students who are first-generation college students and doing research in my lab. I went along with these students to a conference in New York City, right in the middle of Times Square, and the students presented at the Eastern Psychological Association annual meeting. And so since I have the electronic copy of this poster, and the research I think is interesting and will be interesting to those of us who are following our work, I thought it would be kind of fun just to pull up the poster and give almost like a brief little presentation of the research in poster format. So this is what the poster looked like. Although at conferences there's tons and tons of these, and they blow them up, usually like 3 by 4 feet or something along those lines, and put them up on boards. And the students and or faculty, whoever is doing the research, will stand by these posters. And it kind of is like an open office hour thing. You put them up for somewhere between like 90 and 120 minutes. You stand there and people come up, and sometimes they'll read the content on the poster, which obviously there's sort of a lot going on there, so you can stop and just sort of read. Or they might ask the person who's presenting to give them a little walkthrough. So rather than getting you to read all of this, which you probably shouldn't even try because it's a lot of information and it's probably not super, super big on your screen, though I'm hoping that the figures, so where you can see the data, are big enough for you to see, because I'll point those out. But I'm just going to give you a walkthrough, kind of like you're at this conference. So the background to this research is basically that we know that practicing retrieval, or bringing information to mind, can be really effective at helping students learn. And we know that good studying and good learning is induced by good processing. So getting students to process the information in a way that we know promotes learning is best. It's not about specific types of activities. So students can practice retrieval by answering short answer questions that their instructor gives them. They can practice retrieval by bringing out a blank sheet of paper and drawing what they can remember in visual form. They could bring out a blank sheet of paper and write out everything they can remember. It's all bringing information to mind. It's retrieval practice. But in the research, most of the time when we're examining retrieval, we are having the students produce something. So writing something, drawing something, creating something, saying something. It's overt. And that is kind of necessary, or at least it's ideal in most research scenarios, because we want to know what the students are actually retrieving. But one question that I've asked in the past, and the question that my student and I are asking with this project, is what about just bringing information to mind and then not producing it? So what about covert retrieval? I looked at this in my master's thesis, which was published in 2013, and found no difference between overt and covert retrieval, but with very, very simple, basically wordless materials at that sort of basic research level, where the materials really are not anything you would be learning in a university or a school setting at all. And it's a contrived scenario, but basically found in these very, very tight, controlled situations, covert retrieval, or just bringing information to mind, works just as well as producing it, typing it in that case. But then some other research by Tauber and colleagues published in 2018 found that overt retrieval was better than covert retrieval when using complex definitions, complex materials. The idea being it might be harder for complex information to be brought to mind in a full way. So the purpose of the current project was just to look to see if the learning benefits from overt and covert retrieval practice in live classroom settings with real classroom materials, what that looked like. So experiments were conducted across a number of classrooms, cognitive psychology, learning, and research methods. And so you can see we're reporting 5 different experiments here. But I'm going to focus mainly on experiment 5 because that's the one that's the most interesting. So all of this up here is from experiments 1 through 4. And if someone was coming up to my poster, then, I might talk about each of those experiments if they're interested, but I'm really most interested in this fifth experiment. And in this experiment, and along with Dr. Jana Weinstein, gave lectures in research methods classes. And for one of the lectures, we would stop and ask the students to either write out the answer to a question or think about the answer to a question. And this is actually sort of similar to what happens in real lectures. A lot of the time, at least when I'm giving a lesson, I'm talking, and I might pose a question to the class, and I'm hoping that everybody in the room is stopping and thinking about the answer to that question. But then I call on one specific student, and that student is the one who overtly produces the answer, says the answer out loud, or maybe they can't, and I end up just telling the students the answer. So during the lecture in the experiment, we would stop and sometimes actually stop and take the time to have the students write out the answer, and then sometimes have them stop and just think of the answer. And then we would cold call one student for an answer. They would produce the answer out loud, and then we would give them feedback on if it was right or wrong. And the students really don't like this cold calling, but they know that this is part of the experiment and that it doesn't matter if they get it right or wrong. They're just supposed to do the best they can. But the purpose of the cold calling is so that everybody in the room really does feel motivation to try to think of the answer, because they could be the ones who have to produce the answer in front of the class. So that's one lecture. In another lecture, they just sit and listen. They're allowed to ask questions like they normally would. They're allowed to take notes, but for the most part, they don't do a whole lot unless induced to do so by me or the instructor. And since I'm not doing that with this lecture, not a whole lot of that is going on. And we had a bunch of different sections of students across different semesters, some at Rhode Island College and a couple at University of Massachusetts Lowell. And we counterbalanced everything across those different sections so that the questions that were asked in an overt format were asked in a covert format across different classrooms, and the lectures were flip-flopped, all of that good stuff, so that we know the results are not about one specific lecture being easier or harder and one specific type of question being easier or harder. Okay, so the students listen to these lectures, and then 2 days later, they're given a short answer assessment. So they might hear a lecture on a Tuesday, and then they have to answer these questions in short answer format on a Thursday. And what we can find here, if you take a look at the data from Experiment 5, overall initial performance is pretty good. So when the students have to write out their answer on paper, they do pretty well. They get about 73% correct, and that's pretty high. That's good. 2 days later, what we find is that there's no difference between overt and covert retrieval. Both groups, in this case it's the same students, it's all within subjects, but when they're in these two conditions, they perform the same 2 weeks later. And it looks like we're seeing a benefit of covert retrieval, or just bringing the information to mind, compared to that lesson where they're not asked to stop and practice retrieval. And there's no difference between these two overt and covert conditions. So what we would conclude from this set of studies, and primarily from this experiment, because this really is the big one that was done, in live classroom settings within the student lectures, that when we stop and ask students questions in class, if they are able to think of the answer, thinking of the answer will benefit them. And this does take less time than having to stop and write out the answer. But if the students are not highly motivated to think of the answer, we might not see the same benefits. And that might be what's going on in that study I talked about a little bit earlier, where Tauber and her colleagues in 2018 found that overt retrieval was better than covert retrieval. So it probably has something to do with our cold calling procedure, and also the fact that this was a real live classroom. The students actually needed to learn this information. It was going to show up on a later quiz that they had to take. The assessment for this particular experiment was not part of their grade, but they knew that they had to learn the information for later. So on that assessment, they were just supposed to do the best they could. So it looks like it is the process of bringing information to mind that's beneficial, not the specific format. And so just thinking works as long as you can successfully get the students to actually bring the information to mind.